Bonjour. Merci.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you for being here so early in the morning. And those of you who are not here won't hear what I'm saying, so I can't thank you for being here. We have just finished the morning broadcast of France Culture, which is just the right way of introducing what I'm going to do now, which is to introduce Olivier Poivre d'Avort, who is going to be our moderator for this morning. I won't repeat what I said last year because you already heard it last year. But I don't want to talk about Olivier Poivre d'Avort. I want to talk about France Culture. France Culture is one of the partners of the Avignon Forum, and I think France Culture has understood how important the Avignon Forum is. France Culture is, of course, as its name clearly states, French. But I think what Olivier Poivre d'Avort wants to project is that culture is multinational, multi-generational, and multinational. And he is going to be our moderator this morning with a number of very, very good people that he is going to introduce to you. Olivier, you have the floor. I won't be able to be here on Saturday, unfortunately, for a very good reason, which is that the French rugby team is playing South Africa, Minister Sir. So that's one way of inviting our first speaker, the Minister of Culture of South Africa, Mr. Matsile. And, okay, I'm good at the protocol because I used to work at the Quai d'Orsay. I'd also like to welcome the former Prime Minister of Quebec, Bernard Landry. Would you like to step up, please, sir? And then, as we are in France, we'd like to welcome someone who comes not from Paris and not from France, an internationally known legal expert, Lawrence Lessig. Please step up, sir. And artists, of course, always take the last seat. And I'd like to invite Yonfan. I saw him with his hat at breakfast this morning. Here he is. And finally, my little brother, a friend of mine, whom, of course, you all know, who's the last one to come up because he's French, he's at home, but he's been around the world as well, Jean-Michel Jarre. Minister, sir, rugby is a game played by men, and this is the problem of our round table. It's a game played by men. I remember that 2 years ago, Laure Kaltenbach, and I like her a lot, said the forum is great, the equality between men and women. And apparently we do have equality of men and women in the room here. Perhaps the ladies have better seats than we have, which is why you're not around this table. And for the next few minutes, we will be able to ask quite a lot of women, Monique Cantos-Bobert, Frédéric Bredin, and 3 others, exceptional women. And we shall be asking them these questions so that we have the equality of viewpoints. Everything's coming through? Is everything coming through? Are you hearing the English? Are you hearing the interpretation coming through? You are. Fine. Now, it's a little early in the morning, so we have to find things to wake us up. And rather than telling you that culture is a factor of social cohesion or a space of well-being, the organizers had a much better idea, which was to ask how many divisions in culture. It's a way of going back over some well-known subjects, culture considered as an element of social cohesion, as against culture against economic development, or culture which generates a well-being over a particular area, or culture as an international influence, culture and countercultures, and matches. There's another match, which is not the match between France and South Africa, another match which is between France against the United States, for instance, or France and Europe, the French cultural exception against the rest of the world, against all comers, and a very different idea, which is somewhat different to culture, which is called the arts in some countries, the cultural industries. So we have a lot of things to talk about this morning, and it's going to be very interesting to hear what you have to say, gentlemen, and to find out how many divisions you think culture has. Not necessarily how many divisions, but thinking of Bernard of Landry, what about the language of culture, the grammar of culture, which of course are very different according to where we come from, where we live, and our personal histories. The idea was to start somewhat dynamically, and it is our pleasure to welcome Lawrence Lessig. Can I call you Larry? Fine, thank you. Larry, you're very well known, and you're as well known as the white wolf, as we say in French. First of all, because you're American, and because you are a professor of law at Harvard Law School. You're a well-known international expert. You've worked a great deal on internet. You're a specialist in constitutional law and the subject that we're going to discuss here today, which is intellectual property. And if I could perhaps in one word summarize your thought, you think that interpretation can be extensive of copyright and can jeopardize creation. There's a very famous article that you wrote about 10 years ago, which was "The Code is Law," which summarizes your conception of freedom in cyberspace. You've also founded Creative Commons, which is a non-profit making association, the aim of which is to broadcast works and establish new practices in terms of digital works. Do you realize, coming here to Avignon, here in France, that what you say is not politically correct in Europe?
Well, I had the great honor of being here 4 years ago, and you taught me very clearly 4 years ago that what I have to say is not well respected here in France. So I'm happy to come back, and I want to continue that type of conversation, because the story I told 4 years ago was a story of the internet liberating, in my view, culture, moving us from what we could think of as a read-only culture, where people spend their time consuming culture that was created elsewhere, into a read-write culture, where people were much more participating in the creating of culture. And I thought that was fantastic. I was a cheerleader. But the story I want to talk about today is a little bit less sanguine. It's a story of copyright, of the internet as it relates to politics. Because I think as we've seen the internet develop in the context of politics, in the short term, its effect is something people celebrate around the world, but in the medium term, it's not so clear that it's doing any good. I think that story is clearest in the context of what we saw in the Middle East. In the short term in the Middle East, we saw, of course, the internet explode in a way that made it possible for dictators to fall. But in the medium term, the concern is that the internet brings out, amplifies the pathologies of these societies. We haven't seen democracy replace what there was before, and we've seen the internet now turned against the very people who created this great movement. I think you see the same dynamic in the United States. In the United States, at the birth of the internet, people celebrated, especially we Democrats, celebrated the way the internet made possible all sorts of new participants in the political system. In 2004, Howard Dean, a governor from Vermont, a tiny little state, just about became the Democratic nominee for president against George Bush because he was an anti-war candidate whose message was amplified by the internet, until this very embarrassing video of Howard Dean became viral on the internet and destroyed his campaign. But then in 2008, it was the internet that made it possible for Barack Obama to defeat Hillary Clinton because he could use the internet to raise money in a way that Hillary Clinton did not, and he became the president. So in that sense, it was empowering and it created all sorts of new opportunities. But in the medium term, I think its effect has been quite dark. The single pathology of American government is the way in which we fund elections. We privately fund elections, which means that candidates spend their time raising money to fund elections. And as politics in America has become more competitive, candidates spend more and more time raising money to fund their campaigns. Members of Congress and candidates for Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power. I mean, people who are not from America can't quite believe it because it seems so ridiculous, but if you watch the life of a congressman, they basically go from Capitol Hill, racing off Capitol Hill to a call center where they sit there on a telephone for 2 to 4 hours every single day dialing people from across the country to raise money. And as they do that, they develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do affects their ability to raise money. They become shapeshifters as they adjust their view to make it easier to raise money. Leslie Byrne, who is a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she came to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, "Always lean to the green." And then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. So the point is, this is the dominant way in which they think, how to raise money. Now, most of that money is raised from the large contributors. Indeed, the relevant contributors here comprise no more than 0.05% of America. About 150,000 Americans fund these campaigns in large contributions. But what the internet has done is increase the space, the opportunity for small contributions. But what's dangerous here is that these small contributions are most effective at the political extremes. So the Tea Party was given birth by the internet, and they raised millions of dollars in small contributions. But the business model of fundraising here is extremism. So on the left and the right, the model is be as extreme as you possibly can to excite the base to fund your campaigns. Chris Murphy, who's a senator from Connecticut, the youngest member of the United States Senate, describes that when they send an email out, he's a Democrat, attacking the Republicans, they raise 3 times the amount of money that they raise when they send an email out praising the Democrats, and it's the same the other way around. So the point is, you create a dynamic in this context where they're spending all of their time raising money of demonizing the other side. Demonizing, of course, which makes it increasingly difficult to actually govern, because if one day you're calling the other side the devil, it makes it very difficult the next day to turn around and put your arm around the other side and actually pass legislation to govern. So what you see in America is the increasing destabilization of American government. It can't govern. There is no important issue the American government can resolve sensibly because of this dynamic of fundraising. Now, the ultimate question is, can the internet save us? Because I think in this context, in the medium term, the internet has sunk us. And the answer to that is, well, only the internet can save us. There's no other structure that could help us overcome this, this destruction of the way in which democratic government functions. But it's not clear. It's not clear that it can, because there's no evidence so far that we found a way to build in the internet a cross-partisan movement, a movement that can rise up and link different political factions to be strong enough to overcome what has become this pathological dynamic in American government.
Est-ce que depuis toutes ces années...
Over the past few years, and you've defended the freedom of internet, have you seen positions which were very radical between the American positions? Because there's a great deal of debate in America about this, but the notion of copyright in the American sense of the word, and these positions which very often collide with European positions on copyright. Have those two positions come closer together? Has internet brought overcome these divisions to a certain extent? the notion of copyright in France and in the United States? Has there been a change? Have things come closer together because of Internet and the digital world?
I don't think in the context of the elites there's been much change. But in the context of the youth, there's not much difference. I mean, even when I was here 4 years ago, I attended an amazing event at the university here where the forum brought an event to the university and the students in the audience were asking questions. And among the students, they didn't seem any different from young people in the United States. They thought about this issue in exactly the same way. They saw the internet as a liberating force that gave them the ability to create and share their creativity and critique and be much more aggressive in the context of participating in the creation of culture. And that's exactly how kids in the United States think about it. But at the elite level, there's a radical difference, I've not seen much at the elite level to call progress yet. I mean, I don't think there's yet a recognition of the way in which this platform has fundamentally changed the dynamic. And I'm hopeful that will happen, but if it doesn't happen at the elite level, eventually the elites die and the kids take over. So in the long run, I don't think there'll be much of a difference.
Merci Larry, parce que je pense que le débat est largement...
Thank you very much, Larry. That gets us off to a good start to this debate. I don't know whether Jean-Michel Jarre, who's going to take the floor now, is going to say anything very different. Jean-Michel, you're an artist. You're the artist around this table. But you are also, and I won't recall your artistic achievements, it's fairly amusing because what happens very quickly when one introduces you is that one talks about the number of records you've sold, 80 million, but that doesn't sum you up. You've been around everywhere, on stages everywhere, all over the world for many years, and you've discovered many different cultural areas, the developing countries, the BRICS, the developing countries which are no longer developing countries, which are developed countries now. But you're also now, and you have been for the past year, president of SACEM. I don't know whether Larry knows what SACEM is, but perhaps you could introduce it to us, because you've become president fairly recently, and you have all sorts of very good people, Manso Elegikichos, Marcelo Pinheiro and others, and I presume that SACEM reacts to or has some reaction to what Larry has to say, don't you? Doesn't it? Yes, I very much agree with what Larry has just said, basically, and I would say that there was this was a political approach to internet rather than a word or two about intellectual property. SACEM is a sleeping beauty, basically. That's my view of it. It's the International Confederation of Authors and Creators Societies, which brings together associations of 100 countries, roughly. It's not only musicians and filmmakers, but artists, several million artists, who are photographers, plastic artists, sculptors, filmmakers, writers, and media people as well. So SACEM is not is composers, it's creators. It's creators, yes, the C at the end. There are 5 of us who run this confederation, with artists and creative artists who are neither American nor European, but they represent the other parts of the world, and not only musicians and filmmakers, as I said, but Jevarata, who is an Indian poet, a great Indian poet. He's here with us, I think, perhaps not this morning already. And another thing I wanted to say is this. The problem, which is not really a problem, but which has perhaps been a little ambiguous over the past few years about copyright, is that artists have really not been capable of getting their act together and telling civil society what copyright is all about. And it seems to me that civil society has considered us to be people looking in the rearview mirror, people who were afraid of losing our rights, and considered us as people who were sitting on our gold mine and didn't want to give it up. Now, that's not the problem of intellectual property. It's not simply an economic question. It's not simply a question of copyright. It's one of the pillars of democracy. Let's face it, the fact that we can consider today that intellectual property is just a problem of the rights of authors and creative artists and only concerns a minority of people in our society is wrong. It concerns us all of us in society. All of us have a brother, a son, a sister who wants to be a photographer, who wants to be a musician, who wants to be a creative artist, a journalist, and who has to do something else to earn a living. So that's not necessarily anything tragic as long as we think about, and we must think about, the way in which we can harmonize those relationships between the new creators, in other words, people who make creative works, and the people who broadcast them in the new pipes. In a smartphone, the smart people are us. We're the people who create content for smartphones. So we have to have a sustainable economy so that culture is considered as the key to sustainable development. And it's interesting to see to the extent to which culture has become a priority in the BRICS countries that you were referring to, Olivier, just a few moments ago. I've just come back from China. The Chinese government has just organized a very large forum as culture as a key to sustainable development. Now, that may seem rather surrealist to us if you consider it's being organized today by the Chinese authorities, which just goes to show that there is a real paradigm shift in all those countries, in the BRICS countries. It's the case in South Africa as well, and I hope that Minister will tell us about it. But it's the case in Brazil, it's the case in China, it's the case in India. There is a real thought going into how culture can be invented or reinvented, and we need to learn from each other how culture can change the economic nature of the relationship between the content and the way in which that content is broadcast, the content and the pipes. I am familiar with what Larry has said, and I agree with him very largely. Myself, I was very much in favor of Creative Commons, but you don't get any money out of it. No, but don't forget that Creative Commons, and let me explain it to you for those of you who are not familiar with it, Creative Commons is, to sum it up, the idea that we should be more flexible in terms of the law, and that we should make available what people create to other people, which I think is fine. And Larry has said this too. As long as the artists agree. You can't tell artists what to do, like Pravda used to tell artists what to do. You can't force artists to say, you must make your work available free to everyone. No, the difference between Larry and me is that Larry is someone who is an employee. He would be in France anyway. And I presumably it's the same in the U.S. When you're in an academy, when you're in a system, you're an employee. You earn a salary, and a professor in France, at least, is paid by the taxpayer. So his work should clearly be available to everyone because they're paying for it. But culture, and it's very different, is vulnerable. Artists are vulnerable. The woman at home who wants to write a novel and who just can't get started, somebody who dreams of being a photographer or a movie maker, but he doesn't know how he's going to live from his work. And he's probably going to have to give up and do something else because he simply can't earn money from his work. And that's the real question today. So you're saying to Larry, if he was a composer or a musician, as you are, he would not be so keen on Creative Commons. No, I'm not saying that, and I don't think that's what he's saying.
Exactly right. And SACEM, or I thought SACEM has been for many, many years a supporter of giving artists the freedom to choose whether and how they want to make their work available. And that's all Creative Commons does, is make it simple for them to choose. So I don't actually think there's much difference at all between us. I think a culture needs to find a way to make sure that professionals get supported. But the thing I think the internet has taught us is that we also need to find a way to make it possible for amateur creators to be able to create freely. Those two things have to happen. And the extremes in this debate are those who think the only important creators are the professionals, or the other side that thinks the only important creators are the amateurs. But I'm at neither extreme. I believe we have to evolve the copyright system to facilitate both. And the copyright system right now doesn't help either. Artists are not benefiting by the copyright system in the current internet age. The artists have been losing extraordinary amounts of money because we still have a copyright system from the 19th century. And amateur creators are being threatened in all sorts of ways that doesn't benefit ultimately the artist. So all I'm saying is we have to update copyright law to the digital age to achieve the objectives of both the professional and the amateurs. And I think the conversation that's been happening with groups like SACEM has been enormously progressive, helpful. Here's the big difference between America and Europe. In Europe, the culture organizations are artist organizations. SACEM represents artists. In the United States, the culture organizations are publisher organizations. RIAA represents the recording industry, or the MPAA represents the film industry. So I think the conversation is between artists and the future, not between the publishers of a particular age or the producers of a particular age and the future.
Juste un mot.
Jean-Michel, non, bien sûr.
Pas du tout monopoly.
I don't want to monopolize the floor here, says Jean-Michel Jarre, but I agree with what Larry has just said when he says that there is clearly a difference in viewpoint in terms of copyright between the European idea and the American idea. Basically, the American idea is the idea that the owner is the one of the copyright is someone who produces it, whereas in Europe, the property, the ownership of the work is the person who created it. And that's basically where we differ in Europe vis-à-vis the United States. And I think Europe has always been in the avant-garde of this thought, and creators are looking to France today. Don't forget that David Lynch, Woody Allen, people like that wouldn't be making films anymore if they didn't get the benefit of the European approach to copyright, as we understand it in France. But they are niche. They're niches, aren't they? No, they're not niches. No, not niches in the commercial sense, but no, I was talking about some creative artists to go along with what Larry was saying, and they don't have to go through the standardized US production systems. The only danger, the only risk of what Larry has said in the past is that he wasn't understood. As I understand it, there is a tremendous confusion between the freedom of system and sure. If you are an amateur in the Latin sense of the term, then you should be able to produce freely. You should be able to be an amateur creative artist. And if you're a professional, however, there must be a way that you can make money out of it and earn your living from it. And the problem of culture today, and it's always been the problem, culture has had to invent and reinvent its economic system. It has to be economically viable in one way or another. And I think we should stop demonizing Internet, thinking that Internet is an enemy we need internet, and internet needs creative artists. So what we have to do is, we too, in the cultural industries, we have to invent a way of having our works broadcast in the best possible way and earning from it. So we won't demonize Larry, we won't demonize the internet. But before giving the floor to my next guest, I'd like to ask you this. Over the past few decades, you've traveled a great deal. 30 years ago, you were mounting concerts in China. And you've seen culture all over the world. And if you were to make a prophecy about what's going to happen in 10 years' time, what will you be saying at the Avignon Forum in 10 years' time? The antagonistic views about copyright that we're hearing today, do you think that will have melded into something with a little more consensus in 10 years' time? I mean, you've just said that the Chinese authorities consider that culture is contributing to sustainable development. Do you think that will contribute to a more global view and to a less antagonistic view? I don't like the idea of globalization, says Jean-Michel Jarre. I think the difference between internet and culture is that internet, but we could talk about printing as well a few centuries ago, has always been technology, and artists have always been confronted with technology, and we have to use technology for our own purposes as artists, and that's what I try and do, and that's what all artists try and do. But the difference, I think, there is a big difference between international, global, and universal. Those are very different concepts. Culture is universal, and what you have to do as a creator, in Europe, for instance, or in America, is to find what you have in common with an Eskimo, with an American in the Midwest, with a child from any continent whatsoever, to dig deep down into your roots. That's what the creative artist has to do. And to promote that in emerging countries is fine. And we have to find an economic system for those creators in developing countries, and find a way of making it viable for them to develop their identities and develop their creative juices. And what SACEM is trying to do today is to say that the Maori creations, the Maoris in the Fiji Islands, or the Aborigine creations are being stolen by the fashion industry without them realizing it. And the fact that you can't identify the creator is a bad thing. Larry's comments may have led us to believe that copyright should be done away with, and this is an old idea which should have gone out with the stagecoach, and so on and so forth. And it's now simply a dream among French and European people. I wonder whether we shouldn't invent the notion of eternal copyright, so that the rights can be perhaps be paid into a global fund, and that global fund can help the innovative emerging creators. The difference between the North and the South is also a difference in the way in which culture is approached, a way in which people are given the means to express their own culture. This is the respect of the intangible culture, the intangible rights, and that's what we must try and defend. Now, that's leading the conversation off onto a tangent compared to what I was thinking of, because we're now getting into the areas of counterculture. But you're talking about North-South, you're talking about a global solidarity fund for culture, and Paul Matashile is with us here this morning. He's the Minister of Culture of South Africa. We've talked about your country a lot in France this year, not only in France but also throughout the world, not only for your rugby team but also for your culture. There's been a year of South Africa in France, which has revealed what we all know, but what a lot of people didn't know, which is that there is a tremendous amount of creativity in culture in South Africa. When you're listening to this conversation between a well-known international legal expert and a well-known French composer, do you think this is a discussion among rich countries which have a fairly easily defined version of culture and internet? Or do you think that in your country you have different challenges, different difficulties, or do you feel you're in the same league or in the same group, or are you very different? What's your feeling about that?
Hello. Well, firstly, let me greet all the ministers here present and distinguished guests and fellow panelists. Yes, we do have the same debates. But I just want to start, firstly, just to look at the topic of the divisions. Yesterday, when I spoke briefly, I talked about the definition of culture and described it as the soul of the nation, basically our way of life, something that defines who we are. But if you look at the various aspects of culture, I want to talk about just three. Firstly, that culture plays a very important role in economic development. If you look at the cultural industries today, all of us can argue that, in fact, it is the driver of economic development in many countries. And as a result, I think that's where the debate should focus. How you transmit that through whatever medium of broadcasting, internet, but I think we must start by asserting its economic role. Hence, in my country, we have invented the term of the golden economy, what we call the Mzansi golden economy. The second aspect is social cohesion. In South Africa today, we use culture to foster reconciliation and nation building. We use the spirit of what I call Ubuntu. Now,
what does it mean?
Ubuntu, if you spell it, is U-B-U-N-T-U. And basically, if you were to briefly explain it, it says, I am because you are. In other words, you know, people become what they are because of others. So in other words, you need to encourage cooperation between people and nations as well. So we have been driving the development of the new democratic state through this concept of Ubuntu, which basically is what President Mandela taught us, how to bring people together from diverse backgrounds. Hence, we talk about people united in their diversity. And culture does that. It drives that kind of coming together.
Il faut que vous veniez dans le gouvernement français, là.
You should join the French government. We need people like you. I'll explain to you what that's all about. But if you're looking for a job one day, then I think you should get a job in the French government.
Let me make the last point. The last point. So that was my second point, social cohesion. The third one is cultural diplomacy. I believe that we should use culture to build relations between states. I often say when I meet with ministers that often when countries talk about relationships, they talk about trade. So I come to France and I talk about trade between South Africa and France is growing. But in fact, the power is to ensure that people relate, people-to-people relation. Because if I understand your culture, I can do business better with you. And often that has been forgotten and put at the back. And I think the forum like this should bring that to the front and say, if you really want to encourage good relationship between countries and ensure that they strive for peace together, building democratic institutions, then they have to understand each other's cultures. And hence we talk about cultural diplomacy. The last point, of course, is the role of government in all of this. Some of the speakers yesterday were talking about whether or not you need more of government or not. My view is that government must play an enabling environment. Whether you're talking internet today or not, you need legislation to make things to operate properly. And I want to argue that, in fact, in the era of internet and digitization and so on, you may need to do legislative review to ensure that you close the gaps where there are loopholes. So you can't wish government away. When one of the speakers was talking yesterday, I thought I was going to lose my job because it was almost like we don't need ministers of culture. Yeah, but in fact, I think we do. So my point is that, yes, let's allow people to be creative, that artistic creation, but government must be supportive. Bring the private sector on board. So resources must come not only from government. So I agree, we can't have artists all over the world complaining that government is not supporting them. We need people to be self-sufficient where possible, bring the private sector, but government, particularly in developing countries, must play a leading role to use culture to drive the economy, create jobs, particularly in poor rural areas, and make sure that they foster social cohesion, but also build relation with other countries. So that's what we're doing between South Africa and France, the South Africa-French season. I'm also going to the rugby tomorrow evening. It's part of that, building relationship. We'll see who wins. But the important thing is that everybody can say today South Africa and France has a good relationship. Why? Because of the cultural exchanges we do amongst others. And we must do that throughout the world.
Non, mais c'est en rugby, on sait très bien que vous allez...
Well, in rugby, we know that you're going to win. You're going to beat us. You're going to thrash us tomorrow. But as far as cultural policy is concerned, you're very dangerous opponents because your ideas are very clear. You've expressed them very clearly. Now, on the basis of that idea of social cohesion, economic development, cultural diplomacy, that others call soft power, how can you, do you think, influence what's going on through the political weight of South Africa, through the economic weight of South Africa? How can you influence your African brothers around you? I don't know whether you heard our president a few years ago, the previous president, who said that Africa didn't enter history, didn't have its history. And I'm sure that irritated a lot of people in Africa, and it still does. That phrase, Africa has not entered history. That's not a subject, as somebody said. But if I'm speaking to an African, and Africa is not only considering culture today as a factor of social cohesion, but as a real wealth. There is an art market which is developing. There are cultural industries in Africa. How do you think you can influence the world? I mean, there are the American giants, the huge European market. How are you going to try and gain influence on that continent?
Firstly, let me say that if, for instance, I talk about social cohesion, you will realize that it's not a very new concept in the African continent. In fact, in 1912, one of the leading figures of the African National Congress, which is the ruling party today, made the call for the unity of the African people as part of building a very strong liberation movement. So already at that time, there was a call for people to unite across tribes. It came again recently in the 50s. The leaders in Africa came up with what we call today the Charter of African Cultural Renaissance. So already there is a very strong movement in the continent to bring the African countries together on the basis of cultural cooperations. We as South Africa have, for instance, entered into cultural agreements with Angola, with Senegal, with Mozambique, with Nigeria, many of the countries in the continent. So I believe that Africa is on the right way in terms of using culture as this soft power to build relations. And then we're taking it even a step further to the other parts of the world. We have strong links with the BRICS countries, as South Africa, we're part of that. But with other countries, like we're doing the South Africa French season, next year we're doing the South Africa UK season, we'll also do the South Africa Chinese season. So already we are using our cultural relations to strengthen the bonds of friendship. And of course, influence. When you use culture, you seek to influence others with your way of life, but they also impact on you. So it's a two-way thing. It's not just you will influence other people with your culture. They also influence you. So it's a mutually beneficial exercise. And I think it's very important. That's why we talk about it as power, because you want to ensure that you open new avenues for your artists to express themselves. So it has become a global thing. And I'm sure many people were aware. This year we had a debate at the UN where everybody was saying, you know, when we came up with the Millennium Development Goals in 2012, we forgot culture. But we shouldn't do that post-2015. Culture must be at the center of driving development.
Mais le sujet n'étant pas...
But that's not a subject that everyone agrees on. Culture, how many divisions? That's the title of this round table, and there's a question mark. Quite apart from the divisions between copyright in the US sense and copyright in the European sense, do you think that between the North and the South there are divisions? And do you think that you represent the South around this table today? Is it true to say that the South, countries in the South of the hemisphere have not really got all the keys to culture and cultural industries?
There may be differences between the North and the South, but we are grappling with the same issues. I mean, in my country, when I meet with people in the sector, they raise the same issues about copyrights. We also have a lot of fake goods these days. So whilst the internet has created a lot of access, but it has also created a lot of challenges. Because people can download your music, your work without paying for it and all sort of things. So I would say that while there may be different forms of legislation, but the problems are almost the same. And that's why we need more cooperation because the movement has become global.
Quand vous rencontrez vos homologues,
and when you meet your Chinese and Brazilian counterparts, do you have things in common? I mean, Brazil, South Africa, China, you meet each other quite often. This is a different alliance than the one we used to, or am I very much mistaken?
Yeah, well, many people are saying we are the smaller player there because the Chinese are bigger. Brazil, but we think that relationship is beneficial to us because, of course, it's not the only relationship we have in the world. In fact, some of our major trading partners are actually not in the BRICS setup. So, but we think that for the South-to-South relations, that relationship is beneficial. We think that we have a lot that we can influence those countries on, just apart from the issues of trade. So I'm quite happy with how things are unfolding at the moment within the BRICS countries.
Jean-Michel, vous vouliez réagir
Jean-Michel, you wanted to say something about Africa. Yes, I wanted to react to what I've just heard about this issue of the contribution to Africa to the rest of the world. It's absolutely immense. In music, the two major changes in the 20th century in music for Europe and the United States was electricity, recorded music, and then you have electric music, and Africa, because Africa has introduced new rhythms which gave rise to blues, jazz, rock. It all came from Africa. So the contribution from Africa is there, is very much there, and it really shows that the culture of a continent, not only of a country, but of a continent, can have a major influence on the rest of the world. And that, of course, is the case of Africa in the music of the 20th century, and it still is today. Fine, so Africa is enlightened. Yes, of course Africa is enlightened. It throws light on us all. Larry, and then I'm going to ask Yonfan to take us to China.
We shouldn't ignore that there's some important differences here. I mean, the North-South divide is not so important in copyright, although it's significant. It's the extremism of the North's view about intellectual property as it affects patents has been extraordinarily significant in the South. So when the United States forces South Africa to stop the production of AIDS drugs because it violates an extreme view of what patent rights gives the United States, that I think is a devastation caused by an extremism in the thinking of around IP. And the biggest contribution the South has made to this debate in the context of patents between Brazil and South Africa and India and China has been to push back on the extremism and to ask the fundamental question, what's the purpose of this regulation? And it can't be that the purpose is to block access of poor people to drugs.
Merci, Yonfan.
Thank you, Yonfan. You are the most serious people among us, because if you hadn't woken up this morning, we had a text to read. We loved your films, Astromounts 20 years ago's Pioneer Pavilion and many others. You've had great actors, Maggie Chang, Daniel Yu, great Chinese actors have played in your films. You were born in China, Taiwan, Hong Kong. You are a citizen of the world. You're a filmmaker, a photographer. Even if your text is already here and you're going to read it to us, and of course we shall listen to it religiously, how do you react to this conversation between our three friends here this morning? I'd like to hear you say that, and then, of course, you can read your text. Please go ahead.
Yes. I definitely, since last night, I found I am totally out of this place because everybody was so eloquent and so powerful and so cultural. And here I am, I write something, and something about stories. So for now, I think it is a little bit rest for you to hear some stories. The first story I'm going to tell you, it's starting from yesterday. When I was getting off the bus, I met a very nice gentleman, and we talked. And then later on, when I was in the lift, and I met this gentleman again, I talked. And then when I was on the way to the forum, I met this gentleman again, and we talked. And then he said, "Is this your first time in the forum?" I said, "Yes, but I am a substitute of," and then we were separated by the traffic. So the story did not end. And then I found out this gentleman was Nicholas Seydoux, and our chairman. And so today I'm going to finish the story, because the story is I am a substitute of Wong Kar-wai here, because as you all know that none of my film has been shown in France. Nobody knows me in France, but Wong Kar-wai was supposed to come here to give you the talk without writing the manuscript. Yeah, so, but 2 months ago when Wong Kar-wai's film, The Grand Master, was nominated for 12 film awards in China. And that is in equivalent to your César Awards. And the ceremony is right now in Taiwan. So I became the substitute. So when one guy was calling me about 2 months ago and asked me to attend here, I look at it and I say, I'm not a person to debate. You see that I'm a slow talker and everything passes a tempo for me. So even this morning in the breakfast room, I was frightened by you. I know you're going to moderate.
We're at 2, I should say at 7 o'clock, quite early.
Yeah. So one guy was telling me that, don't worry, you don't debate, you just tell them stories. So here I'm going to tell you the stories of 2 women. These 2 women were powered by the influence of film during the World War II, both in the East and the West. They served the purpose of being propaganda for their dictatorship government, and both of them have different fate after the war. Leni Riefenstahl of Germany and Shirley Yamaguchi of Japan, known to the Chinese as Li Xianglan. Leni Riefenstahl was praised and condemned by her 1935 work on Triumph the Williams and the 1936 Olympic Games, Olympia. Both are documentaries commissioned by Nazi government about Hitler and the Third Reich. After the atrocity of World War II, despite her protest to the contrary, Riefenstahl was considered an intricate part of the Third Reich's propaganda machine. Condemned by the international community, she did not make a film for over 50 years. She was a strong woman and a woman ahead of her time. While Shirley Yamaguchi, a small-town Japanese girl from Manchurian part of China, picked up by the propaganda bureau of Japanese militant and transferred her to a Chinese movie star and a chanteuse. She was given a Chinese name and identity to portray the girl next door, whose movie roles always falls for Japanese men and their way of living. She became a big movie star in both places during the Sino-Japanese War. To the Chinese, she was such a nightingale that nobody has the heart to criticize, and to the Japanese, she was the perfect girl that Japanese men want in China. She embodied the symbol of a better friendship between China and Japan during the war in lieu of being a brainwashing machine. At the end of World War II, she was arrested by the Chinese government for treason and collaboration with Japanese. A Japanese spy and a traitor to the Chinese people. She was sentenced and facing the death penalty. Just days before the execution, her Japanese identity was officially revealed and she was sent back to Japan. She was much more fortunate than Leni Riefenstahl. She continued her acting career in Japan, Hong Kong, and Hollywood. And she even served as a senator in the House of Parliament for 18 years in Japan. How different the fate of these 2 women ends, being a propaganda machine in terms of films in the World War II. How the film can be such a powerful media to influence people in the political terms. As we all know, that from the beginning of time, there is art, and art is culture. Culture is not like food that we cannot live without, but it is more important than food. It architects our lives. Throughout the evolution of time, we have categorized art in 7 different forms, and then there comes the combination of them all. The movie, the cinema, the film. It reinforces of all those 7 arts to become the most powerful of them all. It is more three-dimensional than the paintings. Sculpture, the architecture right in front of your eyes. It is more accessible than music, concert, and the dance performances, and it certainly contains drama and literature. It became an easy entertainment and certainly a more pervasive form of culture. It can be massive media, and definitely it is powerful. Through a single projection to the big silver screen, one can deliver the message to thousands of people and then let them see what you feel. It delivers and tries to ask the viewers to follow. The power of this cinematic culture, it's something that influences you without knowing. And then it becomes all popular. For good or bad, you either become a very good person or become a victim of it. While we were talking about the power and the films, that will come a new term called star power, the movie stars. In the past and this 21st century, the actors throughout their screen images can influence people's way of thinking. And the make-believe characters of their persona on the screen is even bigger than the politicians. In India, the movie stars are more popular than the politicians. In some countries, the movie stars even become presidents in an easier way, good or bad, as they always will be remembered better than their fellow colleagues. If the people in the films were giving such power, the power to shape up their society, what should they do about this gift? As we all know, power is the ability to influence the behavior of people. And the culture is something that influences people materialistically and spiritually. Power can be seen as evil or manipulative, but culture can have the ability to turn this negative energy into positive. Now let's go back to these 2 women that opens this subject. Leni Riefenstahl was a woman ahead of her time, and as mentioned earlier, who has a penchant for unconventional cultures and a strong wish to make powerful films. She did fulfill her dreams by being the propaganda machine of the Nazi and the Third Reich. No matter how artistically it is done, it is still time to judge her right or wrong. Why Shirley Yamaguchi? You know, I missed my last page. Why Shirley Yamaguchi, through the sweetness of her true nature, and her music, her songs, become one of those evergreen music songs both in China and Japan. So, power and culture, to be or not to be, that is the question. Thanks for the patience.
Oui, c'est moi au petit déjeuner.
Well, I took the last page over breakfast to see whether you'd written the text yourself, and you did. So thank you very much for having been here, and thank you for having given us this great parable on culture. Let's leave it like that, hanging in the air for the moment, and perhaps I can ask Bernard Landry, who has a tremendously long experience in politics. He was a head of the Parti Québécois, a figure in North American politics, because you were Prime Minister. Mr. Masashali will perhaps be Prime Minister of South Africa one day. But you were Prime Minister of Quebec, Bernard Landry. In Quebec, you speak the same language as we do. We've had a lot of exchanges on culture, but you also very North American. You know what the Anglo-Saxon world is all about. And after this first round of contributions, and before giving the floor to people in the hall, how do you see the cultural world developing? How has it developed over the past 2 years as you've seen it from the vantage point of Quebec? Well, my situation in my position around this table is fairly complex geographically. To my right hand, I have the representative of a country of 250 million people. To my left, the representative of a country of 1.3 billion. And I come from a country of 8 million. So, I mean, that shows you the difficulties of small countries and how it's difficult for small countries to preserve their culture and to have a culture, to have a dialogue, which we'd like to be on an equal footing with others. But that dialogue has, of course, has to obey the mathematical equation. What has happened since the Second World War is basically that we've had tremendous human success. That's the way I would put it. As two American economists have said a few years ago, the Earth has become flat. And they weren't talking about the fact that the Earth is round geographically, but they were talking about the fact that the world has become global, exchange of everything, exchange of trade and so on and so forth, and of course exchange of ideas and culture. Now, when that globalization really started to become a fact, there was a lot of demonstrations, anti-globalization demonstrations. There practically aren't anymore. They've now become alternative globalizers. They're not non-globalizers, they are alternative globalizers. In other words, they've become aware of all the benefits of the way people can communicate among themselves throughout the world. But there are dangers that they point out. And one of the dangers is a danger for us in culture. This word globalization comes from English. And one of the dangers of globalization, which is contained in that word, is what one could call cultural homogenization. And that would be absolutely disastrous. If mankind were to move slowly towards the same language, that would be a tremendous step backwards for thought, for culture, for the affection that people have for each other, for the connection between the generations, where grandchildren could no longer speak the language of their grandparents. That would be an absolute disaster. Now, I'm very happy to say that people are aware of that danger. And let me give you a few anecdotes linked to what's been going on in Quebec. At the summit of the Francophone countries in Beirut in 2002, Quebec proposed the notion of cultural exception. We proposed that. France immediately said, yes, we agree with that. And all the Francophone countries did as well. And that was communicated, I'm happy to say, to UNESCO. And now that is a planetary value in various treaties on trade, and it is now established that a cultural exception is absolutely essential. I mean, there have been some ratifications which have dragged their feet a bit. Yes, but people still talk about it, except when we signed a free trade agreement in 1988, and there was a cultural exception in that free trade agreement. So, although people now say that there shouldn't be a cultural exception, it is in a treaty. Now, there is a free trade agreement between Canada and the European Union, but there isn't a cultural exception. There are negotiations going on between the United States of America and the European Union. And all that means that this is going to be a larger trade agreement between the EU and China. So the cultural exception is gaining ground. And what that means is that culture is not something that can be bought and sold. Culture is a human value, and it is connected, of course, to the economy. Of course it is, but you realize that, don't you, in North America? The leading industry of the USA is not the automotive industry, it's the cultural industry. And in several countries, even in developing countries, as they're called, culture is the leading industry, and culture saves them. There is a favorable wind blowing in Africa on that. And people have often thought that economically Africa couldn't catch up with us, but a lot of people knew that Africa was very, very rich in cultural terms. So culture serves them. Your Minister of Culture in Quebec is of African origin, isn't he? Yes, he's called Makakoto. He's the Minister of Culture in Quebec. And he said that if I was born in Quebec, I would have been called Marc Croteau. But he's the cultural minister, and he's a very good cultural minister, isn't he? Yes, yes, he is. And let me add that after being involved in economic affairs for dozens of years, I was Minister of Economic Affairs, Minister of International Trade, and so I know all that. I've been there. And my conclusion, as I've already said here in Avignon, is that the prime value of a nation is not its economy, it is its culture. If a powerful and dynamic economy is at the service of culture, then it is very possible for that country to be happy. But to sacrifice everything to the economy without thinking of the beauty of music, theatre, literature, and so on and so forth, which play a far more important role in people's lives every day than the stock market indices and traders' bonuses in London, far more important than those. As I've already said, and I shall say again, here in Avignon, there is a World Economic Forum in Davos every year. But I think the world should focus more on Avignon than it does on Davos, because the most important values of the world are being discussed here and not in Davos, not between representatives of the great multinational companies, for whom I have the greatest respect, some of them who are here, by the way. And that's why I expressed my respect for them. Because, as I've said, the culture is the leading value of a country. But, of course, we have to find ways of paying artists and paying for concert halls that conductors can use. And France, I think, is an excellent example. I know that you've been fairly nostalgic over the past few years. Well, we have been for the past few years. Yes, yes. But I was in Paris before I came here, and I've seen that as well. But you thought that you were onto something, and you didn't really believe in it. Now you do believe in it. And people are starting to share our views. Yes, the rest of the world does share our views. How come 70 million tourists come to France every year? It's not because you have mountains and oceans, because there are mountains and oceans everywhere in the world. It's because of your culture, it's because of your architecture, it's because of your museums, it's because of your lifestyle. That's why people come to France, and that's why people go to a lot of other countries. Let me come back to the issue of Quebec, because I was asked to talk about Quebec. Culture, of course, is fundamental for a country of 8 million inhabitants. First of all, because we fought to save our culture. We were colonized by the most powerful and effective colonizer in history, the British, the English. And they decided to beat our language out of us, as they'd done with the Scots and with the Irish. And we stopped them from doing it. We stopped them from getting rid of French. You were too French. Yes, and cultural activity in Quebec is, of course, very important for our people. Céline Dion is more prosperous, is more popular in the United States, according to the opinion polls, than Elvis Presley was. And she's from Quebec. She was born in a village called Charlemagne. And when she was given the Légion d'honneur, she said that she was very honored for the small village of Charlemagne. And the journalist didn't know that Charlemagne was the village in which she was born. Céline Dion, as I said, and the Cirque du Soleil. The Cirque du Soleil, which is also very important, and the revenue of the Cirque du Soleil and Céline Dion is higher than hundreds of Quebec and French SMEs. So the link between economy and culture is quite spectacular and very, very big. And we were talking yesterday about the role of the state, the role of government in developing culture. The cultural exception is basically to make it possible for governments to continue to intervene. If in trade, subsidies are forbidden. In culture, it isn't, because governments have to intervene in countries of small population. They don't have to in the United States. People pay for their cinema tickets and their concert tickets and all the rest of it. Although your foundations, your private foundations, very often provide subsidies to culture, but you say that the government doesn't intervene. But even in a country like France, you have to support, it's the government policy to support movie making and other forms of culture. And that's what Quebec does as well. And let me conclude by this anecdote. I talked about the Cirque du Soleil. The Cirque du Soleil has knocked all the other circuses into a cocked hat, including the Barnum and the others. And the Cirque du Soleil started with a subsidy of $1,000 to buy a big top from the government of Quebec. They were street buskers, no more than that at the time. And they came to ask for a subsidy of $1,000. And they were given $1,000 as a subsidy. And they earn that in 15 seconds today. There are tens of thousands of employees of the Cirque du Soleil throughout the world. So when the state is there to save culture, it can not only have a cultural impact, it can also have a big, big economic impact, because culture does have economic impact in many countries. Thank you. Well, I think you've summarized the what's at stake here. You've told us about Quebec, what's at stake in Quebec, and I think you've destroyed the idea that it's only large countries with a large economy who have cultures that are worth anything. You have talked about cultural diplomacy. I'm not going to say soft power in English to you, but you in Quebec have given Quebec a global image, and there are very few countries which do have that global image. And in Quebec, you're very sensitive to equality between men and women. And obviously around this table, we're not respecting that equality. And ni Françoise Benamou, Monique Cantus-Tabert, Frédéric Breder are not here. They are not here, as I thought they might be, but they are represented by other women, and Louis Azoulay, Laure Barcos, Susanna Fritscher, and I think someone else is here. Now, could I ask one of the women here, I'm going to be very discriminatory, to ask one of you if you'd like to speak. No, that gentleman there, you can't speak. I'm sorry, you're not a woman. You can't speak. Later on. Introduce yourself, please. Laurence Leny, Orange. I'm in charge of music and cultural products at Orange, the telephone operator. We've talked here about culture, how many divisions. I think that with the digital technology, there's a paradigm shift. And this brings us back to economic issues, because the question is, how do artists create their works and earn a living from them in the digital world? That's fine, but we haven't talked about the power of numbers. We've talked about the economics, the politics, but the power of numbers is also very important. Should we... well, you've asked a question, so you answer it. What do you think? Well, I think that as we are now talking about economic issues, my question about that is this, and it's particularly a question for Europe. If Europe doesn't work together to create a real European culture, then it seems to me we shall find it very, very difficult to have influence, because in terms of culture and the distribution of culture, there are some huge companies today who have a great deal of economic power, and they are more powerful than European companies, and it'll be very difficult for those European companies to maintain the sale of their cultural goods if they do not come together and work together. I was in South Africa last week and I attended AfricaCom, and for the first time we talked about the distribution of culture and music in the digital world. And there is a lot more going on in countries like South Africa and Asia. And in Europe, there is a set of rigid regulations, and those rigid regulations don't always make it possible to expand and benefit economically. And there's another group here, thank you very much. Hachette is here as well. Laure Barcos, you're here as well, so I'll give you the floor too. Laure Barcos from Hachette. Yes, I wanted to raise a few questions and ask the question, how many divisions? What is astonishing is that the people around the table, even the Creative Comments in this debate, you all seem to agree. And I think everyone said that copyright and authors' rights had to be respected. I think everyone agrees with that. I'd like to pay tribute to Pascal Regard, who has carried out a crusade on the cultural exception in the European Commission. And what I think is very disappointing is that we all agree worldwide except in Europe. So I think, to answer the previous speaker, the problem is not that we should come up with a European iPad. That's not going to get us anywhere. In Hachette, we are trying to influence IDPC or W3, which are influencing the digital world. We have to be in those organizations to know what they're going to do, to try and reorient their products in terms of EDRM and all the rest of it. But there's something else we must try and do as well, which is in Europe actually defend copyright and authors' rights. And we must not be outdated on that. The French are considered as conservatives and outdated and all the rest of it. So how many divisions? I think we should have several European countries around this table, but they can't be because they don't agree. Whereas Africa, Asia, Landry, Quebec, everyone agrees except the Europeans. Well, the culture, how many divisions? It was a bit of a consensus. As Simbel Kocha is here, and I'm going to ask him, you know her, you're a cultural activist, and I'm going to introduce you. basically, this was among us, this discussion, but in your country today, culture means something else. Culture, how many divisions? Not in my country today. I'm very happy to say that I found out here today that culture is important because the Islamists are somewhat outdated in Tunisia. It's because of, and if they're being counted in Tunisia, it's because of artists. So those in power today are afraid of the artists, and there are some artists and some rappers in Tunisia who are imprisoned, as they would have been under Ben Ali. And so the power is afraid of artists. I'd also like to make my contribution to this subject. I didn't think that artists in Tunisia were important for 20 years. We did a little bit of this and that, a bit of dance, a bit of documentary. We felt that we were out of place. And many people consider that they're considered Tunisia with pessimism today. But I'm optimistic because we are artists and the power is afraid of artists. They're afraid of us because they're afraid of the debates, they're afraid of the body. And what will save Tunisia is education and artistic education. And thanks to Bourguiba, we in 23 provinces in Tunisia, there are maisons de culture, and that's where musicians and dancers start to learn their trade. So we have to go on with that. We have to do everything anew. And you have to support us and not tell us after 2 years, but Tunisia has gone down the drain. No, Tunisia won't go down the drain. Thanks to Bourguiba, women and artists are up and running in Tunisia, and they will continue to be. The only problem, and the idea of our American friend gave me another idea on this, which is that we must find money. Quite apart from Orange, quite apart from all the partners that I see here in Avignon every year, the Islamists, they have a budget for Islamic cultural development because they've understood why it's important. There are associations in Tunisia which are not called Islamic anymore. They are called cultural associations, and our Turkish friends are doing a lot of things to promote Islamism through culture. They've understood how to do it. But as for us, culture is a second skin. I have 30,000 people who come to see my dance free, who come to see our documentaries and our design. Thanks to Olivier Poivre d'Avor, and I take this opportunity to thank you for that. You took the meeting in Toulouse and brought it to Tunis. I'm a dancer, and I want to invite you to Tunisia on the 8th of March. It's the Marathon of Words in Tunisia. Tunisia is doing well and will continue to do well thanks to its women and thanks to its artists. Thank you very much. So I suggest that we suggest to Nicolas Seydoux that he invites the Islamist groups in Tunisia to come and debate with us next year. Why not? And the second resolution is that we should stop talking, because I think Simbel Kocha has really given us the conclusion. She's very committed, and I think her words are the conclusion to this debate. I'd like to thank Larry, Bernard, Yonfan, Jean-Michel, and Paul for having been with us here this morning. I'd like to salute Plantou, Belligan, Liz Donnelly, who've given us the cartoons, and we are very happy to be here to see all of you here to debate about the power of culture. 50 years ago, the government thought that it was absurd to create a radio reserved for cultural broadcasts. And France Culture is now one of the radios which is a very different type of radio and which has an increasing number of listeners. So a good match tomorrow for South Africa, and thanks very much for being here this morning.
Merci. À bientôt.
Merci. Et
Thank you very much. I'm not sure how to present this person now. I know how I introduced him last year. He's Hector Obalka. And among his works, there is this tremendous title, It's the Apples That Have Changed. That's the title of one of his works. So it's not easy to introduce an artist who is also a researcher. And when I saw him before this presentation, he said to me, and I find it great what he said to me, he said, and I quote, "I hope that you will remember what I did last year and that I will be just as good this year." So for those of you who weren't here last year to listen to him, I hope that you will like what you hear today. And those of you who were here last year, I hope that you will find him just as good as he was last year. So Hector, you have the floor. So be up to your reputation and make it interesting.